2001. Big year for football, as I remember. I think Sven Göran had just taken over the England job. That was before the bombshell of the summer. Although he and Ulrika seem very happy together now.
Have I Got News for You starts tomorrow at 9 on BBC One.
Wherever you're going, ask your travel agent for your free Foreign Office travel advice notices. Don't go before you know.
Why do you make me feel so guilty about it? I've never even mentioned it!
It all happened so quick, didn't it? 1 minute I was driving along and the next minute, bang!
Give it here then.
If we're caught, we're dead.
We should do this again sometime.
I'm getting a week! I've done it for 20 years! Unmissable Monday nights.
You haven't, Nick.
A new story every week. That flight to Rio's all sorted. Shut it, Kev. Clocking off. Monday at 9 on BBC One.
News around the clock now on BBC One from BBC News 24.
Peter Jennings. Good evening, everyone. We begin tonight in Oklahoma City. It has been 6 years now since the bombing of the federal building, and it is less than a month before Tim McVeigh will be executed for what he did. It was, we all remember, that horrible moment when Americans realized that terrorism had truly reached the heartland. There was a simple ceremony today at the downtown memorial where the Murrah building once stood. It lasted less than half an hour. The moment of silence lasted 168 seconds for the 168 people who died, and a reading of the victims' names.
Colden Wade Smith, Chase Dalton Smith.
As the names were read, the families walked to the individual chairs that were dedicated to those they have lost. Tim McVeigh will be executed in Indiana on the 16th of next month, and today 10 people from Oklahoma City were selected in a lottery to be witnesses. Here's ABC's Pierre Thomas.
With today's announcement on May 16th, 250 survivors and family members will gather at this federal prison training facility in Oklahoma City to watch Timothy McVeigh executed on closed-circuit television. About the same time, 665 miles away at the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, 10 witnesses will be seated just outside the execution chamber. 7 family members of those who died in the blast, 2 of those wounded, and another survivor. The identities of those witnesses has not been disclosed. Shortly before 7 a.m., the curtain to the execution chamber will open, and the witnesses in Oklahoma City and Terre Haute will see McVeigh strapped to this table. At that point, the lethal injection will be administered. In Terre Haute, a Midwestern city of 59,000, preparations have been underway for weeks.
We'll begin to transport demonstrators from the parks to
federal authorities are planning for the worst, including hostage-taking, armed attacks, and prisoner uprisings. Schools and courts in Terre Haute will be closed. At the memorial in Oklahoma City, division over whether to watch Timothy McVeigh die.
My feeling is that it doesn't change anything, and to watch that event.
I want the execution. I want this man out of my life.
After 6 years, details of the execution are now known, but there still may be no closure. Pierre Thomas, ABC News, Washington.
And that is indeed the question. Will Tim McVeigh's execution make it easier for people in Oklahoma City to get on, to move on with their lives? Many people there already have. Here's ABC's Dean Reynolds.
It is still the city's biggest attraction.
I've met people here from Australia, England, Japan, all around the world.
Sergeant Mike Ferguson's beat includes the memorial to the victims.
It's a special place. It's a place where innocence was lost.
It's a place where Fran Ferrari almost died. She was at her desk across the street from the Murrah building when it blew up.
I'll always be connected to it at some point, at some level.
But Fran is moving on. Since that day, she's bought the house she always wanted and is continuing her education. She is more than a victim.
I mean, I'm not going to hand somebody a business card that says, Fran Ferrari, survivor Oklahoma City bombing.
Like Fran, her city is moving on as well. Thanks to a $1 billion public and private investment plan, they're putting up a new arena. to go along with a new baseball park. Tony townhouses are sprouting downtown, and there's even a new canal. All of it since the tragedy.
We want to get on with rebuilding our lives and get on with rebuilding our city and just continue to make good things happen.
A new 8-minute promotion from the Chamber of Commerce makes no mention of the bombing.
Oklahoma City is a terrific place to live.
And even though 6 people from a suburban Baptist church died in the blast, the pastor there, Mark Walters, seldom mentions it and wishes the news media would follow his lead.
The media showing, the shows and the books and all those things, that reopens those wounds.
But there is something undeniably different about this year's anniversary because of the pending execution of Timothy McVeigh and the chance it gives the people here to speak of him in the past tense at last.
I had an individual who was injured in the bombing tell me at one point, that SOB didn't get me down. I'm here and I'm going on my life.
And the same can be said for this city. Dean Reynolds, ABC News, Oklahoma City.
Now, the other news of the day at the White House today, President Bush was talking about the environment. He's been spending a lot of time on the environment this week. It's Earth Day this weekend, and Mr. Bush has environmental problems of public relations, of politics, and of policy. On March the 13th, Mr. Bush backed away from a campaign pledge and decided not to regulate carbon dioxide emissions from power plants. On March 21st, the administration announced it would not implement President Clinton's reductions of arsenic in drinking water. On March 29th, the Bush administration rejected the Kyoto Treaty to control man-made gases in the atmosphere. Environmental organizations were furious.
In 100 days in office, this president has assembled one of the worst records on the environment of any president in history.
The White House apparently got the message. This week, the administration said it would leave in place a Clinton order expanding wetlands protection and uphold regulations that businesses report how much toxic lead they release into the environment. And there was another ceremony at the White House today, also on the environment. ABC's Terry Moran is there. They've had quite a week flogging this, Terry.
They really have, Peter. And in private, White House officials admit they are scrambling to repair the president's image on the environment.
Which was why it was Green Day in the Rose Garden. The president, joined by Secretary of State Powell and EPA head Christy Whitman, announced his support for a treaty banning toxic pollutants, a treaty championed by President Bill Clinton.
And now a Republican administration will continue and complete the work of a Democratic administration. This is the way environmental policy should work.
The treaty establishes goals for the elimination of the so-called dirty dozen, highly toxic chemicals such as DDT, PCBs, and dioxins that persist for years in the environment. And on cue this morning, the president's loyal lieutenants sang his praises on the environment.
Global environmental protection is an important part of this administration's foreign policy agenda.
I want to applaud the president for his vision.
The elaborately staged event was the clearest sign yet that the White House knows the president has a problem. Outside the EPA this afternoon, another protest.
We need a president who will protect the planet, not the polluters.
On local news programs.
President Bush is backing off a campaign pledge to limit carbon dioxide emissions.
On late-night talk shows.
Weakening his environmental policies. And he spoke very casually today while eating a dolphin sandwich off his new ivory desk.
And with the general public, as the ABC News Washington Post poll shows, only 46% approve of the president's handling of the environment, and 61% say he favors large corporations over ordinary people. Those numbers have Mr. Bush's fellow Republicans worried.
The White House needs to take some aggressive steps on the environment, I think, over the next year to give Republicans something good to run on the environment.
And some Republicans, especially those who represent suburban districts where this is a big issue, are concerned about the impact of the president's actions on their chances in the midterm elections. But, Peter, White House officials say they don't think their policies are the problem, but the way they've communicated them. They think they need to explain themselves better and showcase whenever the president does something that can be considered green.
Thanks, Terry. Terry Moran at the White House. There are, as Terry knows, other environmental issues looming for the Bush administration. The fight over drilling for oil in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and off Florida's Gulf Coast. Vice President Cheney says the country ought to build more nuclear power plants to deal with the energy shortage. And the Bush administration is also looking at whether to repeal another Clinton ruling which prevents roads from being built on millions of acres in national parks. Now, in the national briefing today, it was a busy day for the space agency. First, the shuttle Endeavour took off for the International Space Station. 4 countries are represented in the crew: the U.S., Canada, Italy, and Russia. The shuttle is carrying a $1 billion mechanical arm donated by Canada. The old arm couldn't reach as effectively across the station's surface to perform mechanical tasks. And also from NASA today, what they're calling the Great City Zoom, just in time for Earth Day. NASA is showing us some of the latest things they can do with satellite imagery and computer technology. This is what it might be like to descend on the Earth from space. Here they zoom in on Washington, D.C. and end just above the Capitol dome itself. In northern Louisiana today, why did the man rob the post office? To get health care. Larry Causey suffering from cancer and he couldn't afford a doctor. He called the police to tell him he was going to commit robbery, gave a note to the clerk demanding money, left empty-handed, and waited for the police in his car. Mr. Causey will get his treatment in prison, paid for by the state. When we come back, the giant pharmaceutical companies and the lawsuit that became a public relations nightmare. And tonight, the biggest study ever done on daycare finds it may make children more aggressive. We'll take a closer look. We'll also take you to the frozen steppes of Mongolia, where the nomads are facing a powerful enemy.
This is BBC News 24. I'm Heather McCarthy. Now the latest headlines. A verdict of accidental death has been recorded on 18-year-old Wayne Jowett, who died when a cancer drug was mistakenly injected into his spine. Robin Cook has accused William Hague of encouraging racist feeling within his party, but the Tory leader has described a speech by the Foreign Secretary as laughable. And President George W. Bush wants to ban 12 deadly pollutants worldwide, but he remains opposed to the Kyoto Treaty on global warming. Those are the headlines. I'll be back with a full bulletin of international news at 2 o'clock. But now it's back to Peter Jennings and ABC's World News Tonight.
In the overseas briefing today, the U.S. and China have concluded 2 days of talks on the incident involving the Navy plane. The Chinese Foreign Ministry released a computer simulation to support its version of the collision that the U.S. veered into the China plane. It also revealed a video showing U.S. jets flying extremely close to Chinese planes. This notwithstanding, today the chief U.S. negotiator said the meeting was productive. In Cuba today, President Castro led a rally to commemorate, to celebrate really, Cuba's victory at the Bay of Pigs 40 years ago. At the time, more than 1,000 CIA-trained Cuban exiles were captured after the invasion failed in 1961. In South Africa today, 39 international pharmaceutical companies dropped their lawsuit to stop South Africa from importing or manufacturing cheaper AIDS drugs. The case may have enormous implications for treating AIDS in Africa and in time may make it cheaper to do so elsewhere. Here's ABC's John McKenzie.
Inside the courtroom, a celebration. For South Africans, the decision means desperately needed AIDS medications will be more affordable. For the world's major drug companies, the end of a public relations nightmare that began when they tried to stop South Africa from importing cheaper, generic AIDS drugs.
That was an incredibly untenable, unconscionable, and unethical position. And finally, the force of public opinion forced them to change that.
The force of an epidemic. 1 of every 10 people in South Africa is infected with the AIDS virus, more than 4 million people. Since the trial began, several drug companies have offered to slash their prices, and now generic or knockoff medications will be available, so that a drug treatment that would cost $10,000 per person per year in the U.S. could be available in sub-Saharan Africa for $500 a year, a 95% savings.
While this is a significant achievement, underdeveloped countries will still need help to pay even those lower prices.
They'll also require more laboratories and trained doctors and support staff to administer the drugs to those who need them. John McKenzie, ABC News, New York.
There is a study on childcare from the government today that every parent who puts a child in a daycare facility may learn something from. It's the most extensive study ever conducted on childcare in the U.S., and the headline, at least, is rather striking. It finds that the more time children spend in daycare, the more likely they are to be disobedient and aggressive when they get to kindergarten. Now, there are many variables here to keep in mind, but by the time they are 6 years old, more than 80% of children will have been in some form of childcare, which is why we asked ABC's Michelle Norris to take a closer look.
The government interviewed those who have the most contact with young children, teachers, parents, and caregivers.
We find that more time in child care across the infancy, toddler, and preschool years forecasts more aggression and even high levels of aggression when children are 4.5 and in kindergarten.
Researchers determined that 17% of youngsters who spend 30 hours or more in child care were aggressive, argumentative, and more likely to get in fights or exhibit explosive behavior. That number fell to 6% when children spent 10 hours or less in child care.
This was true irrespective of whether they were in high quality or poor quality care while growing up, whether they were boys or girls, whether they came from rich or poor families.
Troubling news for working parents.
I imagine that most parents will hear these findings and feel an immediate clutch in their stomach that somehow they've made a mistake in how they've organized their lives.
Any parent who's trying to struggle, work and home life is going to be upset by that.
And perhaps a bit confused, because the study stopped short of answering an important question. Why are youngsters in child care more likely to misbehave? Child development experts offered possible explanations, particularly for children in group child care settings. It is there youngsters learn how to share, how to take turns, and in doing so test how far they can go, behavior that is often fairly aggressive.
Very young children, if they're thrown into social situations too early, before they're really prepared to cope with the competition and the aggression in other children, it makes them more aggressive.
The moral of this story is that we have to find ways to enable parents to be able to spend more time with their children, to rely less on child care.
That's an option that working parents don't always have in today's economy, with families relying more than ever on child care. Michelle Norris, ABC News, Washington.
Ah, yes, more time with the children. Federal law only requires companies with 50 or more workers to give new mothers 12 weeks leave, and without pay at that. The U.S. is actually the least generous of the industrialized nations. In Sweden, a new mother gets 18 months of maternity and parental leave, and she gets 80% of her salary for the first year. Mother or father can take the parental leave any time until a child is 8. England gives 18 weeks maternity leave. For the first 6 weeks, a mother gets 90% of her salary from the government and $86 a week thereafter. German women get 2 months of fully paid leave after giving birth. The government and the company kick in, and either parent has the option of 3 full years in parental leave with some of their salary paid and their jobs protected. And finally, Canada, new parents can take up to a year of leave. Depending on how much they make, they get from 55 to 80% of their salaries. Finally, this evening, we go to Mongolia. You don't get to say that very often. In the 12th and 13th century, the land of the great warrior Genghis Khan and warrior horsemen. And for modern travelers who have been there, a fascinating place where you can visit with the nomads. The British Broadcasting Corporation's Adam Brooks has just been there, and his report is part of our World Watch series. He found the nomads in very deep trouble.
The Mongolian steppe has turned to ice, and in the tent of a nomadic family, Batsuren and his children are waiting out this lethal season. A rare visitor, a Red Cross worker, has brought them supplies and support. But Batsuren is despondent. A herdsman, he's confined to his tent while his animals die from starvation and cold. Their last sheep died overnight. Even what little food they have has frozen solid. The midday meal is a plate of rock-hard cheese.
I worry for our future and for my children. I can't buy them books or pencils or even clothes.
It falls to 8-year-old Gantulga to drag the latest victim out to join the other carcasses. The family's herd used to number 160 animals. Only 10 are still alive. Across Mongolia, temperatures have fallen as low as 50 below zero. And in order to try and graze, the animals have to first break through a crust of ice on top of the snow and then burrow down. And when they get to the bottom, they should find tough little tussocks of grass. But because of the drought last summer, there's nothing there. There's just dust. So the animals starve, and the nomads' lives begin to fall apart. The children scavenge for dung, which is getting scarce. But there's no other way to keep the stove burning through another unforgiving night.
The nomads depend utterly on their animals. Without them, there's no warmth, food, income, or education. If this weather keeps up, the nomadic way of life has no future.
Night's coming on now, and suddenly the temperature's dropping fast. Batsuren decides to bring his last few goats inside the family tent to try and keep them alive. But the thaw is months away, and the animals won't survive. And Mongolia's nomads are just clinging on to their way of life. Adam Brooks, BBC News, Bayan Unjul, Mongolia.
And that is our report on World News tonight. Don't forget Nightline. Tomorrow on World News, 34 countries, $11 trillion, and a lot of angry demonstrators. The Summit of the Americas in Quebec City. President Bush is on his way shortly. I'm Peter Jennings. Have a good evening and good night.
Good morning. It'll be another chilly start first thing. Do expect a frost, maybe even some ice on your car windscreen. But generally around the coast, particularly to the east where we keep the showers and the strength of that northerly wind, temperatures just above freezing here, but also a fair few showers. There could be some heavy ones by morning through parts of Lincolnshire. East Anglia as well, but elsewhere dry and clear. 1 or 2 light showers are possible through Irish sea coast, but generally I think clearing up by midday. And into the afternoon, very little change, just a little more cloud out towards the west of Ireland, some light patchy rain by evening, and the showers continuing through parts of the Midlands, the southeast through parts of Lincolnshire. Could be heavy and thundery at times, and certainly cool as well with that northerly wind. 7 to 9 degrees right along the east coast, 10 or 11 through central and southern areas, and a little bit of shelter and the best of the sunshine. On Saturday it starts bright and dry through central and eastern areas, but cloud building out towards the west and wetter weather spreading eastwards on Sunday. A warmer day though, a milder day on Monday with highs of 14 degrees, but wet and windy for all of us.
Victory in the battle to provide cheaper AIDS drugs in South Africa. Palestinians fire more mortar shells into Jewish settlements in the Gaza Strip. President Bush says he'll sign a global treaty curbing toxic chemicals. And Fidel Castro leads the 40th anniversary celebrations of Cuba's victory at the Bay of Pigs. This is BBC News. I'm Heather McCarthy. There's been a mixed response after the world's largest pharmaceutical companies bowed to heavy pressure and dropped their court action against South Africa importing cheap copies of their AIDS drugs. Campaigners said the decision could lead to developing countries around the world gaining access to cheaper treatments. However, the South African government warned that anti-AIDS drugs would remain too expensive to allow a comprehensive treatment program. The case will have an impact throughout Africa and the developing world. Nearly 3/4 of the world's HIV cases are in Africa. In South Africa alone, 120,000 people died from AIDS last year.
Few celebrating in court today would have believed they'd triumph over the might of pharmaceutical firms who tried to stop cheap versions of their drugs being imported. It still could be years away, but tonight the drug firms claim today's decision would mean reduced prices and greater availability for poorer countries where AIDS has hit hardest.
The intent here again is to combine fulfilling our mission of discovering new drugs and new vaccine, and at the same time expanding access so even the developing world can get wide access to the drugs we discover and develop.
But South Africa is not alone in its struggle for cheaper medicines. At this Kenyan orphanage, a musical welcome for visiting US politicians. All the children here have the AIDS virus, but what they don't have here is drugs. So an opportunity to lobby.
This corporate immorality must stop because it's a crime against humanity.
Without pressure from key figures in the richer world, the case would have dragged on, and with it the prospect that millions more would die, denied even the chance of getting affordable drugs. 1 in 6 people in Kenya is HIV positive. Today's decision offers the prospect of help for those in greatest need. For the millions of people living in Kenya's sprawling slums, the international focus on the price of AIDS drugs obscures one important point: that even basic medicines for TB and meningitis are beyond the reach of many here. Treatable diseases which are just too expensive to fight. That fight is being lost here in the homes of those most exposed to disease. Samuel Kamani can't even afford basic treatments for infections like TB and meningitis, and he's not considered poor.
The cost of the drugs comes to 7 times my monthly income. So I'm not able to afford these things.
Yet copies could be produced for a fraction of the brand price. What stopped this Kenyan factory from going ahead and doing just that is the threat of legal action. Now the way is clear to follow South Africa's lead.
Within our own legal mechanism, we want to create a window that will enable us to access some of these drugs to our populations in situations of dire need and in situations where we think it's essential.
Today's developments might eventually make AIDS drugs more widely available, but for now, even cheaper basic treatments would buy Africa more time. Karen Allen, BBC News, Nairobi.
Mortar shells have again been fired into Israeli settlements from a Palestinian-controlled area of the Gaza Strip. The attack came despite an unconfirmed report that the Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat, may have ordered an end to such strikes. Hamas, the militant Islamic movement, released television footage of its members firing mortars. There were no reports of any Israeli casualties from Thursday's attacks.
It wasn't clear whether the video showed a real attack or a simulation, or when exactly it was filmed. It was meant to back up Hamas' claims of mortar attacks this week. The homemade bombs haven't done much damage, but they're part of a plan to undermine Israeli morale. The mortar fire has indeed rattled the Israelis, especially when 2 invasions of Palestinian-controlled territory did nothing to stop it. On Thursday, Israel retaliated by shelling the area in Gaza it had briefly reoccupied earlier in the week. A mysterious explosion in the West Bank town of Ramallah added to the tension. It blew the roof off the headquarters of a key Palestinian security unit, Force 17. The Israeli army said it had nothing to do with the blast, and Palestinian officials said they didn't know what caused it. Israel has bombed targets in Ramallah before. It says Force 17 is involved in attacks against Israelis, something the Palestinians deny. Familiar scenes of conflict in the town of Hebron. Elsewhere, mortars continued to fall. Israel's security cabinet met to chart out a response. It hasn't announced its next move after provoking international condemnation for using excessive force this week, including the bombing of a Syrian target in Lebanon. Amid fears of a wider conflict, the U.S. President George W. Bush telephoned both the Israeli and Syrian leaders to urge restraint. Barbara Plett, BBC News, Jerusalem.
Well, Barbara Plett says it's unclear at the moment if Yasser Arafat has issued a fresh order to end mortar strikes on Israeli targets.
Well, there have been unconfirmed reports that he did call for such a ban on mortar strikes. It's not clear when that was issued and in what context that was issued. Some of his military officials later said that there is a standing order not to strike Israeli targets with shells. So it's not clear whether, in fact, there was a specific order issued in relation to this week's event, or if there is a standing order, in which case Yasser Arafat would presumably not be able to control what's going on, or if his officials were perhaps trying to deflect attention away from what was in fact a specific order. But again, events on the ground is what's going to prove either way.
Now, of course, Israel has said that there is a need for restraint in the region. Any sign at the moment that they have adopted that as a policy?
Well, the Israelis met at an inner security cabinet meeting on Thursday afternoon to discuss what their next move would be. They haven't announced what they will do next, and they haven't taken any action yet. And there are many things that they have to consider, because their invasion of Palestinian-controlled areas this week was considered an absolute failure in Israeli circles. Not so much from the point of view of it being the wrong thing to do morally or anything along those lines, but that it was an operational failure, a lack of breakdown in communications. First of all, maybe a breakdown of communications with the United States, which is what they've said perhaps caused the U.S. reprimand to be so harsh. They didn't tell the Americans that they were going to go in before they did go in. Also, a breakdown in communication between the politicians and the military officials, not enough consultation taking place, in which case in the end they ended up going in and coming out much too quickly, according to too many people. So I think that they are going to be thinking very carefully about what their next step should be.
Barbara Plett there in Jerusalem. US President George W. Bush says his administration is ready to sign an international treaty aimed at curbing the use of several highly toxic chemicals. The chemicals, known as persistent organic pollutants, are used in industry or as pesticides. They're known to harm the environment and human health. Mr. Bush has been trying to establish his green credentials ahead of an important environment meeting in New York. But green groups still insist the president has an anti-environment agenda.
Protesters at the Bush administration's environmental headquarters, making the case that this president has few green credentials to boast. 9 Greenpeace activists were arrested as they called attention to his recent controversial actions, rejecting the Kyoto Treaty on global warming, breaking a campaign pledge to cut carbon dioxide emissions, and lifting a protection order on millions of acres of national forest.
Protect the planet, not the polluters!
But now, in advance of Sunday's Earth Day celebrations, Mr. Bush has announced a new American contribution to environmental causes. He says he'll sign a global treaty restricting the use of the dirty dozen, 12 highly toxic industrial chemicals.
This treaty takes into account the understandable concerns of less developed nations. When these chemicals are used, they pose a health and environmental threat no matter where in the world they're allowed to spread. But some nations with fewer resources have a harder time addressing these threats, and this treaty promises to lend them a hand.
The chemicals, known as persistent organic pollutants, are no longer used in the United States, but they are still widely present in the developing world. And if this treaty is ratified, poorer nations could be granted millions of dollars to help develop substitutes. It's not the only enviro-friendly announcement from the White House this week. Mr. Bush's aides insist he's committed to the cause, saying his actions are based on science, not public relations. His critics are suspicious of the timing.
This is really part of a Earth Day public relations charade by the administration to cover up tremendous amounts of rollbacks and broken promises on environmental protection of this administration.
Others are not so polite, dubbing their new president the Toxic Texan, a former oil man from one of America's most polluted states. They'll wait for evidence of a sustained commitment to the fight against global pollution. Philippa Thomas, BBC News, Washington.
Well, Philip Clapp, the president of the American campaign group, the National Environmental Trust, concedes that this latest announcement is a step in the right direction.
Well, there's no question this is an important step forward, but it came at no political cost to the president because the entire American chemical industry supports signing the treaty. We don't produce these chemicals anymore, and they've been banned in the United States for many years.
But surely this is all about impact, isn't it? And this is actually now starting to send out positive messages from America on the environment to the international community. That must be quite an important thing.
Well, it's a positive message, but what the real message is America will only cooperate with the world on environmental issues when there is no cost to American companies, and that's what is really fake about today's announcement.
But of course, if you're referring to Kyoto, it was widely accepted that President Bush would never have got the Kyoto Climate Agreement through Congress. So why are you so sure that he is anti the environment?
The fact that the president walked away from the Kyoto Protocol is only one of a giant laundry list of things that the president's done in his first 100 days in office to attack the environment. To give you one example, he walked away from the first new drinking water standard to get arsenic out of Americans' drinking water. That was a standard that it took 17 years to set, and arsenic is one of the most potent carcinogens that our National Academy of Sciences has ever studied. So it's one part of a long laundry list of things he's done. It's very simple. This president responds to industries who complain about environmental protection and not to the public.
What do you think about the timing of this announcement? I mean, it does, after all, just come a few days before this climate meeting in New York, doesn't it?
Yes, that's right, and it comes only a day before the president goes to Quebec for the Summit of the Americas, the annual summit of Western Hemisphere leaders. And he's expecting major demonstrations there, and so he's basically trying to buff up his record at no political cost.
Philip Clapp there in Washington. Cubans have been celebrating their victory 40 years ago over US-backed Cuban exiles who tried to invade the island and overthrow the president, Fidel Castro. President Castro returned to the scene of the invasion, the Bay of Pigs, to address the surviving Cuban veterans. Many in the United States have also been using the anniversary to look again at one of the major battles of the Cold War.
President Fidel Castro guided his troops to victory over the US-backed Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs 40 years ago. He addressed tens of thousands of people, including surviving veterans from the battle, most of them, like the president himself, now in their 70s. And he obviously took great delight in returning to the scene of a battle that consolidated his then relatively new government in power and distanced him from the United States until this day.
When we were alone in the face of an imperialist power that used all its political, ideological and economic force against us and tried to isolate the Cuban people through hunger and disease, Cuba could not be conquered by the imperialist power.
The Bay of Pigs, known in Cuba as Playa Girón, proved to be one of the major battles of the Cold War, pushing Cuba firmly into the Soviet camp and a series of events that culminated in the Cuban Missile Crisis later the following year. More than 100 members of the invading force were killed. Over 1,000 were captured after 3 days of fighting. The defeat was a humiliating one for the then US President John Kennedy. But only now, 40 years on, are key details of the conflict beginning to emerge.
This was the first time that, the United States had been forced to acknowledge a covert operation. A president forced to say, I cannot plausibly deny that we were in fact behind this. And two, it was really the first major open world defeat in the Cold War for the United States of America.
And while they were defeated, the surviving members of the invading force, most now living in Miami, have not forgotten either. They too have been commemorating the events of 40 years ago.
Yes, there were several, well over 1,000 that was in prison. We lost 104 in combat who died, and some of them that were also counted that were executed by Castro when they picked them up.
Relations between the United States and Cuba have hardly improved since the Bay of Pigs. Neither side is forgetting the anniversary, and both are taking from it a very different message. Daniel Schweimler, BBC News, Havana.
This is BBC News. A reminder now of the headlines. The multinational drugs companies have backed down from their threat to stop South Africa importing cheap AIDS drugs. Despite a reported ban from Yasser Arafat, mortar shells have again been fired from Palestinian positions at Jewish settlements in Gaza. And still to come, a helping hand for the International Space Station. Endeavour blasts off with a robotic arm on board to assist in one of the most complicated spacewalks ever carried out. And now with the business news, here's Patrick O'Connell from New York.
Hello. The smile spread for a second day on Wall Street. The Nasdaq's up more than 100 points. Cheered by the surprise rate cut and the prospect of more in the future, alongside some good corporate profits, Wall Street again saw strong buying action. Among the influential movers, IBM, which is in the Dow Jones, that helped as it rose more than 7% on the back of good corporate numbers. After the bell came news from Microsoft. It's beaten the expectations on Wall Street as well. Meantime, in the regular session, there was already strong proof that Wall Street's living for short-term optimism at least. The Dow is up 77, 10,693. The Nasdaq rises more than 100, nearly 5%, 2181.
There's more reason today than there was last week to believe that growth will recover, that the Fed will do what it takes. We don't know where interest rates will have to go to make this happen, but I think people believe it's going to happen now, with much more confidence.
In the past, we've been trained to think that moves on Wall Street are mirrored blindly in other parts of the world. It's not happened in Europe. There are distinct reasons affecting the mood. They're wondering if the European Central Bank sees any need to cut rates, for instance, but nonetheless, with the fear for some big corporate earnings, investors are a bit skittish there on this day. London, Frankfurt and Paris are mildly changed. From the BBC's business desk in New York, that's it.
Thanks, Patrick. In a gesture of conciliation, Turkey's justice minister has called on hundreds of prisoners to end their hunger strike, with a promise that the government was willing to meet a key demand and ease the isolation of inmates in new prisons. The move follows the death of a 14th hunger striker. Demonstrators supporting their cause took to the streets of Istanbul on Thursday. Hundreds of inmates and their relatives have been on a hunger strike against the transfer of prisoners to new maximum security prisons. The president of Burundi, Pierre Buyoya, has returned to the country following an attempted coup in his absence. He was holding talks in Gabon with Burundian rebels when a group of soldiers seized the state radio station in Bujumbura on Wednesday. In his first comments on the failed coup, President Buyoya said he was surprised that such action was taken when the peace process had gone so far. He also praised residents in the capital for remaining calm. India and Bangladesh say they have agreed to return to the positions they held along their joint northeastern border before this week's fighting. At least 18 were killed in the clashes. The fighting took place on the border between Bangladesh and the Indian states of Meghalaya and Assam. The Indian Border Security Force said Bangladeshi forces had already pulled out of the village they seized on Tuesday, the incident which raised the latest tension.
An agreement may have been announced in Delhi and Dhaka, but in places this remained a tense border as the two governments decided it was time to call it a day. Further intermittent firing during the day, with mortars among the weapons being used, created a fresh exodus of anxious villagers making for places of safety. Thousands have been on the move this week, like these villagers in the Dorki area. What had suddenly raised the tension was Bangladesh border guards seizing a village which has been in India's possession since the war in 1971 that brought Bangladesh into being, but which Bangladesh also claims. Bangladeshi forces held on to it until today and finally withdrew after India's border security force broke through their cordon. The Director General of the BSF maintained that there was no justification for Bangladesh's actions.
There is no provocation whatsoever from our side. If there was to be a provocation from our side, there would have been an adequate build-up of forces. We had only 40 men in the BOP, that's all.
The situation along the border had escalated yesterday with a flare-up that left 16 Indian security force personnel dead, as well as 2 Bangladeshi soldiers. It led to India's foreign minister protesting in parliament. The action taken by Bangladesh, Jaswant Singh said, is not acceptable to India. The sort of activity carried out by the Bangladesh Rifles is not acceptable to India. India, he said, was for an early restoration of the status quo. That is what the two countries have now announced. It remains to be seen how quickly the words are matched everywhere on the ground. An old issue of border demarcation has erupted in a way few would have expected this week. One question now is whether it will have a lasting impact in Bangladesh in its general election year. Mike Aldridge, BBC News, Delhi.
The former Beatle, Sir Paul McCartney, is in Washington speaking out for victims of landmines. He urged Secretary of State Colin Powell to increase US support of landmine removal programs in war-torn areas. McCartney said he hoped to use his celebrity to raise awareness of the dangers of landmines posed to civilians even after gunfire stops.
With a stockpile of 11 million landmines, the United States has become a prime target for activists who want to see them banned. The US government has refused to join up to a treaty already signed by 139 countries outlawing the weapon. Singer Sir Paul McCartney and his girlfriend Heather Mills went to Washington to press for a ban.
I expressed the point of view that even brave soldiers who defend the country, who have to be involved in that, I think even they themselves dislike the idea of leaving the war behind them and causing grief for civilians. So the Secretary was very understanding about that.
Heather Mills, who herself lost a leg in an accident 8 years ago, runs a charity providing limbs for victims of wars around the world.
I work with the people. I've lived in the war throughout the former Yugoslavia, and the reality of a full ban, which we all want, is many, many years off. So I'm looking for an interim solution. I've always been the black sheep of the whole situation, and I just basically want to go back and be able to tell people that if another war starts up like it did in the former Yugoslavia, that it will be safer to go out when it's over.
Some campaigners, like the McCartneys, see the introduction of so-called smart bombs, only active for a certain time, as a more realistic first step than an outright ban. The anti-landmine campaign has had a high profile in recent years. But with 26,000 people killed by landmines every year, up to 10,000 of them children, the problem is acute. Fiona Wurge, BBC News.
The Space Shuttle Endeavour has blasted off from Cape Canaveral in Florida on a mission to the International Space Station. The shuttle is carrying a massive robotic arm which will be attached to the space station in one of the most complicated spacewalks ever.
In perfect weather and on the 30th anniversary of the launch of the world's first space station, the Soviet Salyut 1, the Space Shuttle Endeavour made its final preparations for takeoff, ready to carry into space the most international space crew ever. 4 Americans, a Russian, a Canadian and an Italian astronaut.
8, we have a go for main engine start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have booster ignition and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Endeavour, extending the reach of the space station while extending partnerships above the Earth.
A relaxed NASA told them to have fun, as outside an Easter holiday crowd of 20,000 watched the launch spectacle. The space station, currently over the Indian Ocean, will dock with the visiting shuttle, and both the arriving crew and the crew on board the station will be involved. The shuttle's robot arm will be used to assemble a much bigger robotic arm for the space station to use. The new arm, which had to be folded in 2 to fit in the shuttle, will be able to move across the space station into almost any position. So smooth have shuttle missions become that NASA's deadpan commentator seemed unmoved by the stunning finale of Endeavour jettisoning its launch rockets.
A good solid rocket booster separation for Endeavour.
After this mission, work can begin to expand the space station, which now accommodates 3, so that in 2006 it can house a crew of 7. Andrew Burrows, BBC News.
700 miles per hour.
What a wonderful sight. A reminder of the main news. Campaigners have welcomed the decision by drug companies to abandon their lawsuit challenging the South African government's right to obtain cheaper medicines. But the government says some AIDS drugs will still be too expensive. And President Bush, who's been criticised for his environmental policies, says the United States will sign an international agreement curbing the use of dangerous chemicals. This is BBC News. I'm Heather McCarthy.
Good morning. Well, yesterday certainly was a showery and cool day for many of us, particularly through eastern areas, very close to this area of low pressure where we had the majority of those heavy and at times thunderous showers and the strength of that northerly wind. That north wind will again bring down temperatures today and continue to feed us a fair few showers, but out towards the west there is a slight change, temporarily so I have to say though, with high pressure building through many northern and western areas, producing a little sunshine and lighter winds. But then we get weather systems coming up against that high, producing more cloud by the end of the day today to northwest Scotland, through parts of Ireland, and more rain coming in time for the weekend. Now, because these areas of low pressure are coming up against the high through central and eastern areas, there'll be fairly weak affairs on both Saturday and Sunday, but I think by the end of Sunday, all of us will have seen some rain. It will turn milder towards the beginning of next week by Monday, but this area of low pressure bringing the milder weather will also bring us some wet weather and windy weather as well. We keep those northerns, as I suggested today, through eastern areas, just taking the edge off the temperatures. Lighter winds for a time with the high pressure building. Then we start to get the west and the southwesterly winds, bringing us some better temperatures as we head through Monday and Tuesday. So the next few days really looks like this, becoming drier today for a time and through the early part of Saturday, and then rain later on Saturday into Sunday for many of us, milder, but wet and windy for the start of next week. Well, tonight is going to be just as chilly as it was last night, so first thing this morning do expect a frost, maybe some ice on your car windscreen once more, but generally around the coasts temperatures just holding up above the freezing mark, and especially where we keep the showers and the strength of that northerly wind through eastern areas. Here the showers will continue right the way through the end of the night, so expect a disappointing start to the day through parts of Norfolk, Suffolk. Showers from the word go, some heavy ones as well, and where you catch that wind it's going to feel chilly, particularly along the coasts. The southeast is no exception, those showers from the word go, but I think out towards western areas and along the south coast, a bit of shelter here should give us highs of around 10 degrees. Through northern and western areas though, I think, yes, a chilly, frosty and possibly icy start to the day, but some good spells of sunshine, and that sunshine should stay with us right the way through to the end of the day. So not too bad here, particularly through Scotland, northwest England and through parts of Wales. Here, temperatures generally of around 10, maybe even 11 degrees, and with those winds falling a little lighter through western areas, not feeling quite as raw as it did yesterday. But to the east, with that raw northerly wind, 7 or 9 degrees only, particularly along the coasts. Well, it's always a little bit showery and disappointing for the first day of the cricket season. County Cricket Championship starts today. Showers at Surrey, expect them a lot here. Northamptonshire and Middlesex, but elsewhere it should be fine and dry with some sunshine and some respectable temperatures as well. Lighter winds and dry weather certainly for the Super League Rugby this evening as well. Friday evening, 6 degrees here. It's going to be a little bit on the chilly side, and certainly by the end of the match with an 8 o'clock kickoff, do expect those falling temperatures, another chilly night. On Saturday, a chilly start to the day, but a bright one through central and eastern areas. Some sunshine first thing, actually not a bad day, quite promising first thing, but more cloud building out towards the west as that wetter weather starts to spill in. And then, although a milder day on Sunday, we'll all see wet weather, I suspect, by the end of the day. Turning showery for a time out towards the west, but really it doesn't look too good on Monday. For the marathon, highs of around 8 degrees by morning with some outbreaks of rain, wet and windy for all of us on Monday.
World Business Report pays dividend.
With in-depth analysis around the clock.
Next on BBC News 24.
From 1 minute to the next, anything can happen. To keep you up to the minute, BBC News 24 brings you the latest headlines every 15 minutes, 24 hours a day. Continuous news coverage as it happens on BBC News 24.
Our troops repelled human wave attacks, but it was not Flanders. They fought and fell with American allies, but it was not Normandy. And witnessed extreme suffering in the killing fields of Asia, but it was not Vietnam. It was Korea, the forgotten war. On the 50th anniversary of a decisive battle, BBC Two honours British troops who fought and died at Injin. Forgotten Heroes, Korea Remembered, tonight at 9 on BBC Two.
This is BBC News 24. I'm Heather McCarthy. In a moment, World Business Report. But first, at exactly 2:30, a summary of the main news. A coroner has recorded a verdict of accidental death in the case of a teenager who died after a powerful cancer drug was injected into his spine instead of a vein. 18-year-old Wayne Jowett from Nottinghamshire died a month after being given the injection during treatment for leukemia at the Queen's Medical Centre. 2 doctors told the inquest that they had little experience of giving such treatments to cancer patients. The hospital has admitted it failed Wayne Jowett, but after the verdict, his family's solicitor said the lessons which could have prevented his death should have been learnt a long time ago.
Nothing should disguise the fact that the doctors treated Wayne fell far short of their professional responsibilities and are to blame for his death. My client's wish is that Wayne's life and death will not have been in vain. The target announced by the government's chief medical officer on Tuesday for preventing the type of error which killed their son by the end of this year should be a target achievable immediately. And we support the coroner's recommendation to that effect.
The Foreign Secretary Robin Cook has called on the Conservative leader William Hague to lead by example and stop warning that Britain could become a foreign land. Mr Cook made the remarks in a much publicised speech in London. The Tories have said that he's grossly misrepresented their views on race and accused Mr Cook of shamefully using the race card himself in the run-up to the general election. President Bush has been trying to establish his green credentials ahead of an important environment meeting in New York. He's called for the end to the use of several highly toxic chemicals known as the Dirty Dozen, although their use has already declined in developed countries. The government's chief scientific advisor has said that the foot and mouth crisis is fully under control. Professor David King said the policy of culling infected livestock within 24 hours and animals on neighbouring farms within 48 hours was working.
Well, I think this is the first point since the epidemic began when I can say that the epidemic is now fully under control. And I'm using that phrase in the scientific sense. It means that we have a decrease in the number of infected premises being reported daily, and that decrease can be expected to continue.
A woman's been charged with murder after children's bones were found at a flat in Glasgow. Officers from Strathclyde Police made the discovery yesterday evening. The woman is due to appear in court this morning, and the results of forensic examinations at the scene is also expected today. Moves to secure the extradition of the man suspected of killing the British schoolgirl Caroline Dickinson are underway in Florida. Francisco Montes, a 50-year-old Spanish waiter, has been linked to the murder in France by DNA evidence. Montes is being held in jail in Miami after allegedly breaking into a hotel room and sexually assaulting a female guest. Some of the UK's rivers and wetlands are being polluted more than those in parts of Eastern Europe, claims a wildlife report released today. The River Severn and the Trent are among a list of European rivers that will need major restoration work to comply with new EU water legislation, according to the Global Environment Network WWF. Others needing improvement include the Dee in Wales and the Foyle in Northern Ireland. The report points to pollution from agriculture and the consumption of water for industrial and agricultural purposes as key problems. That's the news at exactly 34 minutes past 2. Now on BBC News 24, it's time for World News Tonight.
The drug companies give in. Their legal battle in South Africa is over.
Feel the feel good. It's day 2 of the Greenspan bounce. Here are the numbers. The Dow's up 77. The Nasdaq storms home up a century. Hello, it's the BBC's World Business Report. I'm Patrick O'Connell in New York.
And I'm Michelle Hussein in London. It's a major climb down. The world's major drug makers have abandoned their lawsuit against the South African government. The issue was imports of cheap, generic versions of well-known anti-AIDS drugs and other medicines. The litigants, who included some of the industry's biggest names, said the money they'd lose from those imports would prejudice the funding of future medical research. They'd already negotiated deals with some countries. For example, a treatment which costs $10,000 in the United States can be brought down to $1,000. With generic drugs, it can be as little as $300. Well, with me is Dr. Trevor Jones of the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, and also Justin Forsyth, Policy Director of the international aid charity Oxfam. Trevor Jones, if I can start with you, ultimately, was it the bad publicity that made your industry give in?
No, this is an agreement between the South African government and the industry on intellectual property rights, and very fortunate the South African government have now agreed to honour the commitment to the international agreement. With that out of the way now, we can sit down together and find a way of reaching the patients 4.5 million patients who need medicines.
But the
That's a real challenge.
But the imports of generic drugs are now going to be allowed in South Africa.
No, the South African government have agreed to honour the intellectual property agreement, so they won't be importing cheap generic alternatives. It'll be sitting down with the industry to determine how our medicines can be properly brought through all the infrastructure to the benefit of patients. It's an enormous challenge. There are millions of patients, and the funding for the infrastructure alone is going to be huge.
Justin Forsyth, how would you interpret this decision?
Well, I think it's not really about winners and losers in terms of the Oxfam versus the pharmaceutical industry, but I do think, and I hope, the winners will be poor people in South Africa. But I do think the pharmaceutical industry has been wrong for the last 3 years of blocking progress in South Africa in terms of opposing the Medicines Act, which will allow now, we hope, the South African government to either produce locally, like Brazil does, or import the cheapest possible medicines. And I think this will have a very big impact, not just for South Africa, but for many countries in Africa and much wider.
Justin, can I ask you a sort of philosophical question? Does Oxfam love companies to make profits? And is it the case that you just think some companies shouldn't make profits in some areas?
No, it's not a question for us about profit. I mean, we recognise the pharmaceutical industry needs to make profits to do the investment in the research, but they actually make very few profits from these very poor countries. And what we want to see is a balance here. Yes, they do need to protect their intellectual property very much in the rich countries, but for the poorest countries with huge health crises, we think there needs to be flexibility. And what we would ultimately like to see is changes to the World Trade Organization rules to allow exemptions from the poorest countries for intellectual property for medicines, because otherwise they're not going to be able to buy the affordable medicines they need to meet not only the AIDS crisis, but the malaria, the tuberculosis and the other crises. So that's a real issue for us.
Trevor, I just want to ask you, are you at all worried by, in a sense, any kind of culture of protest invading the corporate scene? I mean, your industry has faced animal rights protesters in the past as well. Do you see this as a theme?
No, this has been a very specific issue about the South African government and their unwillingness until now to abide by the TRIPS agreement. That's out of the way. We've been sitting down with governments throughout Africa, with UNESCO, with UNAIDS and others, and finding solutions, real sustainable solutions for this crisis. The intellectual property rights argument is important internationally, but what's important here now is how we're going to build funds, huge funds, to build infrastructure and the medicines to alleviate these problems. I think there'll be an anticipation in Africa now that these medicines suddenly will be available for everybody with treatment. I don't see that as a practical reality in the near future. What we've got to do is to find solutions.
Trevor, I'm sorry to be hung up on this philosophical question. I know you're talking about funds and treatments.
Yes.
But isn't it the case that as medicines advance, the moral responsibility on companies in your association has grown because drugs can do more now, and you can sell more drugs that do more? So is it the case that you're perhaps out of your depth with what amount to really heavy moral issues about the developing and the developed world?
No,
you're in the middle of it.
I'm very pleased to tell you that we for years have been involved in this kind of activity with leprosy, in river blindness, in many areas of the world, including a very big campaign in malaria. We're used to this kind of activity. What we were hung up with in South Africa was South Africa trying to add to ignore their obligations to the GATT round. That's out of the way. We're very pleased about that. We can now work constructively together. This is a real breakthrough in relationships with the South African nation. And the industry understands how to handle the situation on pricing and arrangements in many parts of the world. It does it all over the developing world. And this is now for South Africa an opening that we're going to be able to work with.
Justin, can I very quickly ask you, when you oppose a lawsuit like this, when you campaign against it, aren't you passing the buck from the governments who should be dealing with the aid crisis to the companies?
Well, the governments have to do their bit, and the ball is in the South African government's court now to come up with a decent AIDS plan. But we also need much wider change in South Africa, and we hope, and I'll ask Trevor here, are you going to actually withdraw the case in Brazil in terms of pushing for that to go to the WTO disputes panel? And will you allow other countries to produce drugs locally?
Well, we're going to make sure that we continue to find even better ways of treating disease. The fact is we haven't cured AIDS. We need more and more research there. And if we can't get obligations to protect intellectual property, the funds won't be there. So our mission is to find winners in terms of patients being cured, and that needs more research.
Trevor, we must leave it there, but many thanks. Trevor Jones and Justin Forsyth from Oxfam, many thanks for joining us on the programme.
And please come back and do it all again as soon as possible. I want to bring you this news out after the bell, which I'll bring you the regular session in a minute. Microsoft's beaten Wall Street's expectations. Sun Microsystems is in as well. Microsoft said that its sales and profits are higher than Wall Street thought. Sun is in line and just beats lowered expectations. Nortel has made a quarterly loss, but in line with what Wall Street had thought. It's day 2 of the Greenspan bounce. Let me just show you the mass circulation newspapers in New York. Alan Greenspan caricature on the Daily News. Alan Greenspan caricature on the New York Post. And these are the numbers on Wall Street. The Dow Jones rose some 77 points, helped by IBM, which is income, you may recall, was higher. It's up 7.7%. Microsoft's up. NASDAQ, though, is up more than 4%, nearly 5% to 2181. Jim Glassman is standing by. Jim, is the stock market reacting to the hope that the Fed can bring the economy back, or is it liking the magic bullet impact of interest rates?
It's acting on hopes. The market is always driven by hopes and fears about the future, well beyond what people can see in front of us. And the market's reacting to the message that the Fed is sending, that it'll do what it takes to restore growth. So you're right, they're responding to hopes that the economy will get back on track.
So given that, the market is engaged in a short-term recovery, perhaps was slightly oversold, but the upside beyond a recovery on the short term is hard to estimate, isn't it?
Right, and I think you have to be cautious about all that. This is not a normal cycle. The stock market was at a very high level last year. There's no real reason to think we're taking off to the races like we normally do coming out of recessions, because we haven't been in a recession and because the stock market was already fully priced for perfection, frankly. And it wasn't until this recent unexpected downfall that the market, and worries about earnings, that the market pulled back. So,
Jim, briefly then, you're telling me there's more buying ahead, but the long term is linked to the economy.
Absolutely. The economy is the driver, and I think people are realistic. They know that we're not going to have a miraculous turnaround in growth. It's going to take time, but everything is going to be linked to how the economy performs. There's more reason today than there was last week to believe that growth will recover, that the Fed will do what it takes. We don't know where interest rates will have to go to make this happen, but I think people believe it's going to happen.
Over the course of the year. Profits had already been hit by the earlier scare over BSE or mad cow disease. The rate cut in the United States has put the spotlight even more on the European Central Bank, which has so far resisted cutting Eurozone rates. The latest from the bank is its monthly report, which hints that it's still against cutting. It says inflation is still a risk in the 12-nation Eurozone. Now let's have a quick look at the closing numbers, and this was the close. FTSE down 18, the DAX up 17, helped up by the SAP software company, which had some good results. Now a reminder, if you want to reach us, our email address is this, biznews@bbc.co.uk.
In the meantime, please, if you can, stay with us. The Business on the BBC.
Sport is all about timing. Miss it and you miss out. BBC News 24 sports updates are at 16 and 35 minutes past every hour, so you'll always know the score. All the main sports stories twice an hour. BBC News 24.
Welcome back to the programme. Patrick O'Connell is at the helm of affairs, firmly at the helm of affairs in New York. I'm Michelle Hussain in London. Those people at Napster are being blamed, at least in part, for a downturn in sales at the world's record companies. Latest figures from the industry say sales fell by as much as 50% in some parts of the United States last year. Consumer uncertainty about the economy was one factor, but the record labels are highlighting the role played by free music on the internet.
The music industry globally may have been worth $37 billion last year, but that represented a slight fall from the heights of 1999. According to the figures, singles and cassette sales slumped by around 2/5 in the biggest market, the United States. The major record companies say the blame lies squarely with websites such as Napster, which allow users to swap files freely via the net.
We want Napster to remove the copyright.
The companies backed by some of their stars have already gone to the courts to force Napster's users to pay a subscription to regain what they see as lost profits. But supporters of Napster can argue that the economic slowdown in the US hit sales. CD sales as a whole worldwide also increased. Europe was the best performing market last year with a 6% jump in sales, but firms there also complained that illegal copying was taking place, especially using recordable CD machines. There was a mixed picture in Asia too, with sales slightly up, but income was actually down 5% on the previous year. Samant Bhatia, BBC News.
Europe's biggest computer chip maker, ST Microelectronics, has issued a warning about growth in the sector. The Franco-Italian group says the market will shrink by as much as 15% this year, with no recovery before 2002. However, profits for the quarter were up 43% compared to the same period last year. Well, earlier I spoke to the President and Chief Executive of ST Microelectronics, Pasquale Pistorio, and I asked him if the continued downturn would mean job losses for his company.
We believe that we are going to face the price competitiveness as everybody else. We have taken corrective measures, including hiring freeze, which will bring some reduction in the overall sales of the company. We are cutting expenditure in SG&A. We are not cutting expenditure in R&D. We are continuing to do our R&D innovation pace faster than the industry, but we believe that we can face this downturn with a kind of a normal corrective thing. We want to protect the integrity of our organization, and I think we are able to protect the bottom line and the organization at the same time.
Pasquale Pistorio of ST Microelectronics. The oil company BP Amoco has faced a backlash by shareholders and protesters at its annual general meeting in London, despite announcing record profits. Outside, environmentalists and pro-Tibet campaigners demonstrated. They want BP to sell its stake in PetroChina, which is building a pipeline through Tibet. Inside, a Greenpeace-sponsored motion pushing for BP to move away from fossil fuel-based energies was backed by more than 7% of the vote, much more than expected.
In common with many business travellers, we're obsessed about time taken to fly by plane and the type of plane offered to people. Well, you'll have heard perhaps that the journey time from New York to London could be cut to 45 minutes by a new jet, hypersonic jet, unveiled by NASA, could travel at 10 times the speed of sound. That's more than 7,000 miles an hour. There's no one behind the joystick. This X-43A will make its maiden flight in mid-May on autopilot and then ditch into the sea. So clearly the news from Boeing of 2 weeks ago about faster jets, this now lifts the ceiling, literally, on what is technically possible.
The stakes are very high. I do find it a bit scary that it could be unmanned. You know, Paddy, I don't trust technology that much. But the thing I find best about it is that you and I could maybe even meet up for dinner, which of course is impossible at the moment when we're trying to present both sides of this programme.
I wondered where you were going with that one. But I think that I thought that the rules were governed by the simple, well, not simple, but were governed by physics about how fast you could fly, which is why jets haven't changed since the 60s. But, you know, clearly didn't get the right message from the physicists.
We would be very interested to hear what our viewers think about that whole debate about size versus speed. Are they thrilled at the thought of being able to cross the Atlantic in that amount of time, or do they have their doubts? Please do let us know your views.
You pay, incidentally, if that ever happens. Now, in the past we've brought you cars with the comments made from regulars, don't forget the environment. Now we'd like to bring you the environment and no cars at all, as ministers from many different countries, around 10, joined a publicity stunt at the United Nations. It's part of a big conference going on, but this was a separate event designed to show the benefits of the bicycle. And they're off, a clutch of environment ministers, trade unions, and some from local authorities. Some found it took some warm-up. The stunt was designed to promote people-powered mobility. There is, in all of this, a strange message for the car industry. The ministers know thousands of jobs depend on that industry, and they're keen to say they're not anti-car. Many European cities have gruesome traffic jams. Cyclists take risks hopping on their bike. So the ministers from Belgium and France hope for change.
We use cars to move in rural areas, for example, between towns, or when we travel with our children and luggage and so on. We use cars also, but it's really stupid to use a car to do 3 kilometers in a town where the underground, the buses, the bicycles can be used much more easily.
I think that the responsibility of the states is to make investments on public transportation, and so that a rational adult has the choice when he goes from his home to his office, and that he prefers to take public transportation or bicycle or whatever, because it's easier. So we are not here to be moral people to say, you naughty, you should take public transportation.
And so, over to you. The message: on your bike. We must head north to Quebec by any means possible, because this is the looming Summit of the Americas, affecting an area from Canada to Chile. Everyone will be there trying to work out where is the future for trade and other issues between at least 33 countries. Among those there, the BBC's Nick Bryant.
The business of America is business. The view of Republican President Calvin Coolidge 75 years ago, and one vigorously embraced by the present incumbent George W. Bush. The slowdown of the US economy has underscored the need for American corporations to nurture markets abroad. In Quebec City then, the new administration is trying to force the pace on the free trade area of the Americas, a hemispheric trading bloc linking almost 800 million people. Already Bush has been using his presidential bully pulpit with evangelical zeal, stressing the new trading bloc's merits in this keynote speech on Tuesday before the Organization of American States.
We want to open global markets so that our farmers and ranchers and workers and service providers and high-tech entrepreneurs can enjoy the benefits of a more integrated world. And of course, we'll pursue these goals throughout our hemisphere, through the free trade area of the Americas. Since open trade is one of my top priorities for our hemisphere, gaining U.S. Trade Promotion Authority is one of my top priorities in Congress.
From the very outset, Bush has been keen to promote closer economic ties with Latin America. Trade a top priority. His first trip abroad, a meeting with the Mexican President Vicente Fox. But negotiating a comprehensive trade deal will be tough, for he lacks so-called fast-track authority, the ability to cut deals which won't be changed by the US Congress. It will deter other countries from signing up to agreements. This is George W. Bush's first international summit, a chance to project America's global leadership in the economic sphere. He wants a free trade pact by 2005, even if the US labor unions and countries like Brazil may stand in his way. Nick Brandt, BBC News, Quebec City.
This time tomorrow, World Business Report will be in Quebec City as we try to get to grips with views from other countries outside the United States.
Now, we're going to go on to emails in a moment. Before that, Patrick, I just have to bring you back to those pictures of you cycling. I'm happy to say that you looked very smooth on that bicycle compared to the great and good of European governments. But that's assuming you did it in one take.
No, but didn't you notice? They were pedalling. I just went downhill. It's the easiest thing.
You cheated.
Yes.
Anyway, we are going to move on now to emails. We've had one from Yugoslavia, from Dragan Obradovic, who says, this is in reference to what we were talking about yesterday when Kate Noble was at the NASDAQ. He says, I find it horrifying that Americans buy stocks they don't save. Is it possible that the biggest economy in the world, on which many others depend, relies on the stock market for its development? What I suppose to point out of this is that the whole idea of Americans investing rather than saving is something that is just a cultural shock to people elsewhere in the world, and certainly it seems to be for Dragan Obradovic in Yugoslavia.
And so to the UK, where Alan Thompson has written, we're told the UK is doing well, better, he says, than both Europe and the US. Why is the pound so cheap against the dollar? I can't answer that in a once-er, but I can tell you that most of the world currency, all the truths about it right now are summed up in the fact that the dollar is strong, and therefore all comparative currencies appear weak. Look at the euro, for instance. A lot depends on the strength of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, and we need to perhaps get to grips with that with a currency professional in coming weeks.
And also at a time when the world's equity markets are looking so troubled, the dollar is seen as a safe place to put your money. Ren Abraham has written to us about an issue we touched on the other day. We had an email asking about buying stocks in foreign exchanges. He says we only gave partially the right answer. He says the real problem is paying for stocks through an online exchange in Indian rupees. India does not allow easy conversion of foreign exchange unless someone wants to travel abroad. So he said that our viewer in India could invest in those stocks technically, but he might have trouble in how he came to pay for them. That's our inbox for today, and in fact that is just about all we have time for on this edition of World Business Report. I'm Michelle Hussain in London.
I'm Patrick O'Connell in New York. We're the business, but thank you for yours.
Good morning. It'll be another chilly start first thing. Do expect a frost, maybe even some ice on your car windscreen. But generally around the coast, particularly to the east where we keep the showers and the strength of that northerly wind, temperatures just above freezing here, but also a fair few showers. There could be some heavy ones by morning through parts of Lincolnshire, East Anglia as well, but elsewhere dry and clear. 1 or 2 light showers are possible through Irish sea coast, but generally I think clearing up by midday. And into the afternoon, very little change, just a little more cloud out towards the west of Ireland, some light patchy rain by evening, and the showers continuing through parts of the Midlands. The southeast through parts of Lincolnshire could be heavy and thundery at times, and certainly cool as well with that northerly wind. 7 to 9 degrees right along the east coast, 10 or 11 through central and southern areas, and a little bit of shelter and the best of the sunshine. On Saturday it starts bright and dry through central and eastern areas, but cloud building out towards the west and wetter weather spreading eastwards on Sunday. A warmer day though, a milder day on Monday with highs of 14 degrees, but wet and windy for all of us.
Inside the mind of a filmmaker, a long way from Hollywood. A short season of films and in conversation. Europe's moodiest director, Ingmar Bergman. Bergman season, films and interviews, continues Saturday on BBC Knowledge.
Victory in the battle to provide cheaper AIDS drugs in South Africa. Despite a reported ban from Yasser Arafat, more mortar shells have been fired from Palestinian positions at Jewish settlements in Gaza. President Bush says he'll sign a global treaty curbing toxic chemicals. And Quebec City welcomes presidents and prime ministers attending the Summit of the Americas. This is BBC News. I'm Heather McCarthy. There's been a mixed response after the world's largest pharmaceutical companies bowed to heavy pressure and dropped their court action against South Africa importing cheap copies of their AIDS drugs. Campaigners said the decision could lead to developing countries around the world gaining access to cheaper treatments. But the South African government warned that anti-AIDS drugs would remain too expensive to allow a comprehensive treatment programme. The case will have an impact throughout Africa and the developing world. Nearly 3/4 of the world's HIV cases are in Africa. In South Africa alone, 120,000 people died from AIDS last year.
Few celebrating in court today would have believed they'd triumph over the might of pharmaceutical firms who tried to stop cheap versions of their drugs being imported. It still could be years away, but tonight the drug firms claim today's decision would mean reduced prices and greater availability for poorer countries where AIDS has hit hardest.
The intent here again is to combine fulfilling our mission of discovering new drugs and new vaccine, and at the same time expanding access so even the developing world can get wide access to the drugs we discover and develop.
But South Africa is not alone in its struggle for cheaper medicines. At this Kenyan orphanage, a musical welcome for visiting US politicians. All the children here have the AIDS virus, but what they don't have here is drugs. So an opportunity to lobby.
This corporate immorality must stop because it's a crime against humanity.
Without pressure from key figures in the richer world, the case would have dragged on, and with it the prospect that millions more would die, denied even the chance of getting affordable drugs. 1 in 6 people in Kenya is HIV positive. Today's decision offers the prospect of help for those in greatest need. For the millions of people living in Kenya's sprawling slums, the international focus on the price of AIDS drugs obscures one important point: that even basic medicines for TB and meningitis are beyond the reach of many here. Treatable diseases which are just too expensive to fight. That fight is being lost here in the homes of those most exposed to disease. Samuel Kamani can't even afford basic treatments for infections like TB and meningitis, and he's not considered poor.
The cost of the drugs comes to 7 times my monthly income. So I'm not able to afford these things.
Yet copies could be produced for a fraction of the brand price. What stopped this Kenyan factory from going ahead and doing just that is the threat of legal action. Now the way is clear to follow South Africa's lead.
Within our own legal mechanism, we want to create a window that will enable us to access some of these drugs to our populations in situations of dire need and in situations where we think it's essential.
Today's developments might eventually make AIDS drugs more widely available, but for now, even cheaper basic treatments would buy Africa more time. Karen Allen, BBC News, Nairobi.
Mortar shells have again been fired into Israeli settlements from a Palestinian-controlled area of the Gaza Strip. The attack came despite an unconfirmed report that the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat may have ordered an end to such strikes. Hamas, the militant Islamic movement, released television footage of its members firing mortars. There were no reports of any Israeli casualties from Thursday's attacks.
It wasn't clear whether the video showed a real attack or a simulation, or when exactly it was filmed. It was meant to back up Hamas claims of mortar attacks this week. The homemade bombs haven't done much damage, but they're part of a plan to undermine Israeli morale. The mortar fire has indeed rattled the Israelis, especially when 2 invasions of Palestinian-controlled territory did nothing to stop it. On Thursday, Israel retaliated by shelling the area in Gaza it had briefly reoccupied earlier in the week. A mysterious explosion in the West Bank town of Ramallah added to the tension. It blew the roof off the headquarters of a key Palestinian security unit, Force 17. The Israeli army said it had nothing to do with the blast, and Palestinian officials said they didn't know what caused it. Israel has bombed targets in Ramallah before. It says Force 17 is involved in attacks against Israelis, something the Palestinians deny. Familiar scenes of conflict in the town of Hebron. Elsewhere, mortars continued to fall. Israel's security cabinet met to chart out a response. It hasn't announced its next move, after provoking international condemnation for using excessive force this week, including the bombing of a Syrian target in Lebanon. Amid fears of a wider conflict, the U.S. President George W. Bush telephoned both the Israeli and Syrian leaders to urge restraint. Barbara Plett, BBC News, Jerusalem.
Well, Barbara Plett says it's unclear at the moment if Yasser Arafat has issued a fresh order to end mortar strikes on Israeli targets.
Well, there have been unconfirmed reports that he did call for such a ban on mortar strikes. It's not clear when that was issued and in what context that was issued. Some of his military officials later said that there is a standing order not to strike Israeli targets with shells. So it's not clear whether, in fact, there was a specific order issued in relation to this week's event, or if there is a standing order, in which case Yasser Arafat would presumably not be able to control what's going on, or if his officials were perhaps trying to deflect attention away from what was in fact a specific order. But again, events on the ground is what's going to prove either way.
Now, of course, Israel has said that there is a need for restraint in the region. Any sign at the moment that they have adopted that as a policy?
Well, the Israelis met at an inner security cabinet meeting on Thursday afternoon to discuss what their next move would be. They haven't announced what they will do next, and they haven't taken any action yet. And there are many things that they have to consider, because their invasion of Palestinian-controlled areas this week was considered an absolute failure in Israeli circles. Not so much from the point of view of it being the wrong thing to do morally or anything along those lines, but that it was an operational failure, a lack of breakdown in communications. First of all, maybe a breakdown of communications with the United States, which is what they said perhaps caused the U.S. reprimand to be so harsh. They didn't tell the Americans that they were going to go in before they did go in. Also, a breakdown in communication between the politicians and the military officials, not enough consultation taking place, in which case in the end they ended up going in and coming out much too quickly, according to too many people. So I think that they are going to be thinking very carefully about what their next step should be.
Barbara Plett there in Jerusalem. The US President George W. Bush says his administration is ready to sign an international treaty aimed at curbing the use of several highly toxic chemicals. The chemicals, known as persistent organic pollutants, are used in industry or as pesticides. They're known to harm the environment and human health. Mr. Bush has been trying to re-establish his green credentials ahead of an important environment meeting in New York, but green groups still insist the president has an anti-environment agenda.
Protesters at the Bush administration's environmental headquarters, making the case that this president has few green credentials to boast. 9 Greenpeace activists were arrested as they called attention to his recent controversial actions, rejecting the Kyoto Treaty on global warming, breaking a campaign pledge to cut carbon dioxide emissions, and lifting a protection order on millions of acres of national forest.
Protect the planet, not the polluters!
But now, in advance of Sunday's Earth Day celebrations, Mr. Bush has announced a new American contribution to environmental causes. He says he'll sign a global treaty restricting the use of the dirty dozen, 12 highly toxic industrial chemicals.
This treaty takes into account the understandable concerns of less developed nations. When these chemicals are used, they pose a health and environmental threat no matter where in the world they're allowed to spread. But some nations with fewer resources have a harder time addressing these threats, and this treaty promises to lend them a hand.
The chemicals, known as persistent organic pollutants, are no longer used in the United States, but they are still widely present in the developing